In this video, I'd like to discuss why we should read Laruelle. What interest is there in reading Laruelle in general and biography of ordinary man in particular. In the first video, we presented the book and at least in part allowed the book to present itself. So in this video, I'd like to give some sort of motivation that could be underlying both Laruelle's project and our possible interest in reading Laruelle. So the first one is undoubtedly, if you're looking at Laruelle, probably you're interested in continental philosophy. So if you're interested in the continental tradition, in that sub-tradition which is, broadly speaking, anti-authoritarian, that mounts some sort of critique of authorities and power in the world and within the institutions of philosophy and within philosophy itself. So if you're interested in Deleuze or Derrida or Lyotard or Badiou or even somebody who doesn't usually count as a continental philosopher, but I think is very largely within that tradition. If you're interested in Feyerabend, if you're interested in going back a little, Heidegger and Nietzsche, Laruelle is influenced by just about all these figures. Maybe he hasn't read Feyerabend, but probably he has, and seems to want to radicalize, go one better in a certain way, although he criticizes this idea of constantly going beyond. He wants to protect their arguments and their ideas in a way that maybe they were unable to provide proper protection and argument against possible critiques. So Laruelle takes all these ideas and all these figures and takes them to the absolute, that's his term, and the book, A Biography of Ordinary Man, is, as we said last time, his laboratory, where he's taking everything in the most uncompromising, with no concessions way, to the ultimate conclusions, to the absolute. So I would say, especially if you're interested in Deleuze, for example, this book is absolutely necessary reading, whether you end up agreeing with it or not. A second thing is, if you want to go further in, not just in the anti-authoritarian aspect, but if you want to go further in the deconstruction, that's Derrida's concept, in the deterritorialization, according to Deleuze, in the subtraction, according to Badiou, if you consider that there's something within continental philosophy, in deconstruction itself or in deterritorialization itself, that is not yet deconstructed, that is not yet deterritorialized, then this is something that Laruelle is trying to do. So in a sense, you could call his work one of hyper-deconstruction or hyper-deterritorialization or hyper-subtraction. A third motivation is something that goes along with this hyper-deconstruction. There's a feeling that within all these works of deconstruction, deterritorialization, maybe in Badiou's subtraction, but that's a slightly different case, that there's just too much negativity. Deleuze goes on and on about Nietzsche and affirmation and so on, but he's the first to say that deterritorialization comes first. He's the first to emphasize in Foucault's work that resistance comes first. So with all these other figures, there's always this idea of an ultimate negativity, dissolution, which may be expressed in non-negative terms, pulverization, dispersion, and so on. And Laruelle is not contesting these ideas, but in a biography of Ordinary Man is constantly trying to formulate them in terms of a positive dispersion, a positive minority, a positive absolute, and a positive sufficiency is what he calls it in this book. Fourth reason is perhaps related to this. Once you've criticized the authorities, and remember this book of Laruelle's could have been called against authorities, but that would have been too negative a title. But once you've criticized the authorities, once you've dissolved, deterritorialized, deconstructed, what you're in danger of falling into is relativism, that anything goes, in the vulgar sense of anything goes, which is not Feyerabian sense. Anything goes, anyone's opinion is just as good as any other's. You fall into the alternative facts, fake news, post-truth type world. And one can wonder, how do we conserve the progress that has been made in terms of deconstruction, deterritorialization, and at the same time guard against relativism? So Laruelle's solution here, I think, for once, and there are other examples of this in the book, is ahead of its time. So I've often criticized Laruelle for trailing behind the others and thinking that he was making a big blow to philosophy when he criticized the philosophies of difference at the same time that everybody that supposedly belonged to the philosophies of difference had already moved on to something else. So I think this aspect of trailing behind is reality, but at the same time, Laruelle, because of his very radicality, is a precursor. So this theme of the absolute became a necessary concept for Deleuze, for example, where in Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy, which came out, I think, in 1991, so several years after this book of Laruelle's. They're constantly talking about absolute speed, absolute survey. The word absolute crops up quite a lot within the book, mainly as an adjective, but there's this idea of absoluity that is needed to avoid the trap and the enclosure within relativism. Badiou's latest book, or latest big book, came out 3 or 4 years ago, The Immanence of Truths, still not translated, but it should be published in English in February next year. So there Badiou makes a move, very like the move that Laruelle makes in 1985. Badiou decides that we have to start with the absolute and look at how the relative worlds appear from the point of view of the absolute. So this is something that Laruelle was already arguing for and then doing in a biography of Ordinary Man. So if you want some sort of context and sort of room for maneuver between two different approaches that are within the same sort of influences and inspirations to a large extent, then reading a biography of Ordinary Man is good for that. It's also good preparation for having a critical approach to reading The Imminence of Truths when it finally comes out, which is another book which I consider to be absolutely essential. Another motivation over and above these particular philosophical figures and these particular philosophical concepts is if you're ambivalent about philosophy in general, if you have a passion for philosophy and at the same time you feel that there's something wrong with philosophy, that you had great hopes from what you could get out of philosophy and are constantly feeling disappointed about what is actually offered or concluded in philosophy. If you're feeling that philosophy is not as rational as it pretends to be, if you're constantly finding sort of logical gaps or non sequiturs, or that there's a sort of, not exactly bluff, but there's a certain sort of carelessness in the philosophers and in the philosophies that you've encountered, and that as well there's lacking to a large extent the human element, that maybe philosophers talk about humanity, the human element, maybe political philosophers talk about democracy, revolution, anti-hierarchy, egalitarianism, and or about care, about the need to take care of the ordinary person and not be elitist. And at the same time, you find within their practice, their personalities, and in the concepts that they manipulate, that there is not a full reflection of that humanity. Maybe the content is human or human-oriented to a certain extent, but there's something in the forms and in the habitual uses that is not human enough for you. That's something that Laruelle has noticed and analysed in philosophy, and he's tried in this book to put humanity at the centre, along with a more consequent use of rationality. And last, which goes along with all these ideas, there's just the institutional experience of philosophy. Laruelle mentions that at the end of the foreword, where he talks about, in the English translation, it's translated as institutional disgrace, which is a little ambiguous, as if maybe he had been feeling disgraced, but it's more general. It's the disgrace of anything and everything that could come up in the institution of anyone. There could be, not necessarily all the time in the empirical sense, but you're constantly coming up against disgrace, or what Laruelle in the forwarded French calls indignity or indignities. And that's something that goes with the inhuman side of philosophy, but it's the institutional experience of these sorts of indignities that occur in institutions, including books, because books are a form of institution. And so that leads to an aspect where indirectly, at a transcendental level, Laruelle is coming out with a critique of the institutions. So, summarizing, we have taken to the absolute, anti-authoritarian posture, a hyper-deconstruction, a concern with positivity, leap into the absolute, reconciliation of affect and reason, of humanity and rigor, and what you could call the deschooling of philosophy, or the de-institutionalization of philosophy. So the idea is that, that's implicit in the title of Biography of Ordinary Man, the idea is that philosophy is for everyone. So Laruelle's actual books can sometimes be daunting at first glance. So I'm trying to provide a set of not exactly keys, but hints and signals, or tips, heuristic advice for reading Laruelle, so you can tap into what is going on within his this book and his other books that is powerful, interesting, motivating, and is at the cutting edge still. This book, published in 1985, is still at the cutting edge of continental philosophy today.